Kabocha squash. If you think of squash and you think of acorn and butternut and you never really know what to do with it, or you just bake it with the skin on and then you end up with a watery mess, which is kind of what those squashes end up being, you need to give Kabocha squash a try. This is a gray Kabocha. There's a couple different types I have here. It's a green one. These I got at the farmer's market. As long as it's a Kabocha, you can pretty much rest assured that you are going to end up with a custardy, thick textured, slightly sweet, delicious piece of squash. And it will really change the game of how you think about working with squash in the fall. I tell you, at the restaurant, I completely stopped using pretty much any other squash for stuff like soup or mashed squash, or one of my favorite things that I'm going to show you right now, these big kind of primal chunks of pan roasted squash. I'm not going to cook them for you. I'm just going to show you how to trim the squash up, because there's a really fun way that you can trim these. Because most of the time when we cook squash, at least I know from my experience, when I was a kid, my dad would maybe bake some acorn squash, and these squash, they have this really thick flesh, and we don't really know how to get the meat out to cook with it, so a lot of times we just bake it, and it can end up getting really watery like that. Well, depending on the type. So I'm going to show you how I like to trim these guys up for one of my favorite sides at the restaurant, which is just pan roasted squash. The first thing to do is get a heavy knife. And sometimes, especially if I have trainees or something like that, I'm going to have them put the tip of the knife, grip it with a towel, just to kind of give them a little more control. I'll do that when I cut the thing in half. But you can see, the sucker is like a squash. It can be dangerous. Some of the worst injuries I've seen have been from people cutting things like squash and large wheels of cheese. When you're really putting a lot of torque on something, you don't want that torque to be your finger. So, here. Well, there you go. So you can see I use the towel to really be able to put some force on it. Then I'll just kind of cut this guy in half again. Then I'll get a spoon. Just going to take these seeds out. And now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to peel it. There's a trick to it, though. A lot of people don't think about peeling squash, from my experience. You want to make sure that you get down through this green part, because just one peel with a peeler is really not going to do it. You see what I'm talking about here? Also, the type of peeler is important. These Kuhn Racones, these are basically standard kitchen issue. Everybody carries one or two. I carry one in my pocket or in my kitchen cargo pants all the time, because you never know when you're going to need a peeler or somebody else is going to need a peeler. You just never know. So there you go. It's not that tough. Take some of the skin off, get as much of the green stuff off as you can, and just kind of reveal that inner squash. Now from here, you can just cut this guy into these like big primal hunks. And what's really fun is getting a pan warm and putting a little fat in it and putting the pieces of squash in it. They don't exactly have to be perfectly uniform. They're not going to be perfectly uniform. But you can just kind of pan roast these guys. And last night I had them tossed with a little bit of wild rice and just some butter, and they're just really wonderful like this. Just a really great way to use Kabocha squash. So there you go, little pan roasted squash chunks, and peel a Kabocha with a peeler. It's not that hard. Give it a try.